Good afternoon. I'm Jaime Darenblum, Senior Fellow and Director of Hudson Center for Latin American Studies. On behalf of the Hudson Institute and our partner for this event, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on Venezuela. Writing in the Financial Times yesterday, Gideon Rachman noted that the current wave of revolts in the Middle East are aimed at the Arab exception. That is, the dismal record of oppression and dictatorship that has so far prevented the Arab world from taking part in the democratic and free market wave that has swept Latin America, Europe, and much of East Asia since the 1970s. Indeed, it is very encouraging that in today's political map of Latin America, democracy prevails overwhelmingly. Unfortunately, there are exceptions to this general march towards democracy and free markets. We may call this march backward the Chavez exception, given the uncontested leadership of Venezuela's president in the trumping of fundamental freedoms in the Western Hemisphere. It is an irony that at a time when Cuba is searching for ways out of the crisis of its command economy, Chavez is precisely pushing strongly to sink Venezuela deeper into a command economy. Looking at the current revolts in the Middle East, questions arise as to the impact of this phenomena elsewhere. Are there fault lines in Venezuelan society making Chavez vulnerable to street turmoil? Are the precedents of such social turmoil in Venezuela? These questions acquire particular relevance at the present time when there are inside presidential elections in that country. To analyze Venezuela today, its society, politics, economy, and foreign relations, we're privileged to host a panel of very distinguished experts. The first speaker will be Pedro Urelli. He is a private statesman. He has served Venezuela as an official in PDVSA. He's a successful entrepreneur, and his knowledge of his native country is truly impressive. Next, we'll hear from a highly respected and influential voice of the U.S. Senate. Carl Meacham is widely known for his expertise in U.S.-Latin America relations. He is the senior staff in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he has directed several reports of key importance to the U.S. and Latin America. Next is Professor Evan Ellis, teaches and does research at the National Defense University. He's a prolific writer on Latin American politics and economics. His latest book on China in Latin America, published in 2009, is a must, which has been received with well-deserved encomium. Professor Tom O'Donnell has had a distinguished career both as a nuclear scientist and a top specialist in world energy. He has lived in Venezuela, publishes frequently on the oil industry in the region. He currently teaches at the New School University. After the presentations of our panel, we'll have a period for questions and comments. Once more, we express our gratitude to Bradley Foundation, whose generosity has made possible this series of lectures on democracy in Latin America. And without any further ado, I'm pleased to turn the podium to Mr. Pedro Urelli.
Good afternoon. I'd like to obviously start thanking Ambassador Darenblum and his colleagues at Hudson for once again dedicating time to focus on affairs in my country. Jaime has been particularly perceptive and consistent in his analysis of the effects of the so-called Bolivarian Revolution, socialism of the 21st century, not only in Venezuela, but also in the region and beyond. I'm particularly delighted every time I read to see somebody who's understood it and has put it in such a good context. So thank you, Jaime. Last September, right before a very important election in Venezuela, the legislative election, there's a similar panel held in the same room. The outcome of that election actually conformed pretty much to what the consensus of the panel would be. As a result of that, Venezuelan politics have been recalibrated, and there's a space now for opinion, debate, and hopefully for good policy. I'm not sure about that at the end, but there will be a lot of debate. There will be a lot of noise coming out of this more balanced National Assembly. Nevertheless, and for the sake of consistency, I will repeat my conclusions of that event. Nothing that has happened since has made me change those. First, despite the desire of the vast majority of Venezuelans to live in democracy and to fight for democracy in democratic means, there is not a quick, democratic, constitutional, electoral, peaceful solution ahead. As a matter of fact, the seeds for a violent and volatile future are very well seeded in Venezuela. Two, the consequences of losing power are extremely high for Hugo Chavez and his cohorts. It is difficult to imagine that they can afford to play fair and square under the rules of the 1999 Constitution. When you play for keeps, it usually means you have to hold on to power, unless you're ready to face justice or worse. While Hugo Chavez, in his constant improvisation, might underestimate the risks, it is certain that many of his cronies know very well what the consequences for them are of losing power. I said then that the 25th of September elections, whatever the outcome, were likely to result in more and not less political turmoil. I think very soon after that, although it was clear that the opposition got 52% of the vote, Chavez did not take that as a true signal of public opinion or public sentiment, and through a series of measures tried to make that point really clear. The enabling law was the one that was mostly discussed, was an absolute blatant attempt to run over the will of the people and the decisions that would have to be made by a new Congress. But there are a lot of other things in which it demonstrated that he was, as always, a sore loser. I also said that a future, an unavoidable transition to Venezuela will be more complex than any that we have seen in Latin America. And that when we compare them to others that we had seen in other areas, even as far as going to the Soviet bloc, there is a series of components that made this transition a particularly serious one. A combination of the nation's problems, which were not created by Chavez but had been aggravated by Chavez, plus the presence, growing presence, of a series of foreign elements, whether criminal or with extremely big appetite for Venezuelans' resources, would complicate the nature of that transition. The other thing was that the damage to the institutions and the fact that there are very few forces that are references for all of society in Venezuela who could act as arbiters or pacifiers also was one of the areas of concerns as to how do you make it to a peaceful transition. I also finalized by saying that there is a possibility for a good landing. But that requires that both Democrats inside Venezuela and Democrats outside of Venezuela do the correct analysis and begin to work on it. I think wishful thinking is actually damaging both domestically and externally. The thing sometimes I find is that people say, if the problem is difficult, let's focus on the easy problems. My view, if the problems are very difficult and you don't find a solution, then you have a very, very difficult problems in your hand. You don't run away from it. You focus more time on it. Having said this, which were my conclusions, I will try to answer the questions posed in this panel, which were basically, will the public see the situation in Egypt and Yemen as an impetus for more moves against Chavez regime, and will Chavez preemptively crack down further on the opposition in light of these riots thousands of miles away? I do not think that Venezuelans are particularly inclined to looking outside of its borders. Venezuelans are very egocentric. We believe that our problems are different, that our opportunities are different, that we will do it our way. This is interesting reference. But the fact is that in Venezuela, we've already been through all kinds of stages of this exact same kind of political unrest that you're seeing. We had a bloody coup against a democratically elected government. The people who actually led the coup are now in government. And funny enough, those people who celebrate the coup as a moment of victory at the same time are trying to squash dissent. So this is the irony under which we start having this analysis. But we also can see other elements. In a city of 5 million people, on the 11th of April of 2002, we had between 600 and 700,000 people on the streets marching towards the presidential palace. The president asked the military to pull the tanks out and stop them. The military refused to do it, just as the military in Egypt has until now refused to crack down. The president then applied his plan B, and people started shooting at the people who were approaching the presidential palace. After 19 people were killed and hundreds injured, the president's top military aide, who by the way has continued to serve the government, announced that the president had resigned. We all watched that on television. It was not invented. There was no opposition person who made the announcement. Clearly, what followed did not follow constitutional rule. But what led to the problems was a plain, old-fashioned people power revolution, like the ones that we've seen in Tunisia and now in Egypt. So there's no denying that at a moment in time, Venezuelans raised up massively to make themselves heard. At the end of 2002 and 2003, there's a paralyzing national strike to try to force the government to step back in some of the measures that it was taking. The strike failed because of two reasons. The organizers had no sense of what their aims were, and Hugo Chavez demonstrated that he has both a keen ear and he has a willingness to sacrifice the future of his country in order to hold power. The firing of 21,000 people from PDVSA is still costing every single Venezuelan dearly. Many of those people did not participate in anything. Some of those people were fired only because they held an advanced degree from an American university. There are people who never went out in the streets, who were just fired in this massive sweep in order to try to take control of a company that had been run professionally. In 2005, parliamentary elections were boycotted, not by the opposition, but by the population. 85% of the people did not turn out to vote because they believed that there were no conditions for a free and fair election. In 2007, in December, following months of student-led action following the closing of RCTV, the regime was handed a significant and surprising defeat in a constitutional referendum. Last September, against all odds, with an amazing level of gerrymandering and with the usual abusive use of public resources from in order to fund the official party's campaign, as I said, the opposition obtained 52% of the vote. So the fact is that Venezuela has been in social revolt. The fact that Chavez remains in power after all of these events is a true, and despite the true expressions of discontent that one sees in every single opinion poll, is due to two reasons, in my mind. One, Hugo Chavez is not a politician. Hugo Chavez is a lieutenant colonel who sees everything as a confrontation between good and evil, between black and white, and does not have compromise or negotiation in his lexicon. Under this type of approach to life, scorched earth is a valid strategy if all you're trying to do is stay in power. The second reason is that the opposition however organized they've been for dissent, have not been able to prove that they're ready to run the country. They're not an alternative that the people feel is ready to take over. They have been incredibly capable of organizing movements of dissent. They've been surprisingly competent, as they showed in September, to organize a single list of candidates when you consider that you're mixing people who are Chavistas, people who come from the left, to people who actually would be from the radical right, if you want to go into that type of labeling. But it's a very large mismatch of the population that had to be put together into a single list in order to obtain the representation that the opposition now has in Congress. Most major polls in Venezuela, however, show that the electorate is tired and pessimistic about its future. They also show that most of the people are not in favor, which would seem to be the president's pet projects. His pushback on private property is rejected by up to 70% of the population. The confrontation with the US is not popular at all. Confrontation with Colombia is not popular. Moving the country closer to Cuba is not popular. Socialism as policy is not popular. But he, nevertheless, stays in power. In order to understand this, I think you have to understand this once again, that Venezuela is very different than all the countries in Latin America. And it's almost like if you had suddenly analyzing in the context of Latin America a Saudi Arabia. Okay? The nature of the Venezuelan state, because of its control of the oil resources, and in addition to it, in an everyday practice, its absolute control of foreign exchange, makes a Venezuelan state a very powerful adversary if it decides to fight against the people. And therefore, I always use an example of, freedom of the press. If you own a newspaper and you have to import newsprint, and in order to import newsprint, you need permission from the government to get the currency in order to import that. And in addition to it, the government, through a process of consecutive expropriations, has become the largest advertiser in the market. How free can you really act? I mean, the environment, the whole context under which you're operating, puts you at a limit that where there are no explicit controls, sometimes through what the press says, there's a lot of self-censorship occurring because of the desire of newspaper owners and even journalists of either keeping a business or keeping a job. The challenge to the opposition, though, going forward, is to turn these high rates of dissatisfaction into an overwhelming electoral majority. Now, you have to do this understanding that the rules will be tweaked to make that outcome impossible. But nevertheless, the opposition must stay this course, no matter how difficult it seems, because the one thing that we have to do is make sure that the last vestiges of democratic, the pretense of it being a democratic government disappear. And therefore, if for no other reason, is to force the government to absolutely have to do what it really wants to do to stay in power, which is get rid of those elements of democracy or those rules of democracy that are now extremely challenging for its survival. Now, in Venezuela, we're at a very, very strange point. One of the things that you hear the most in Venezuela is an expression that says, aquí puede pasar cualquier cosa, which translated means here anything can happen. And this is not figuratively, this is literally. A country in which anything can happen is a country in which nobody is safe. That range of options is not exactly the outcome of good government. You do not want 29 million people to wake up every morning not knowing at all what can happen. There are scenarios in which Chavez can stay for a long time. There's scenarios in which Chavez could leave and there's chaos. There's Chavez in which Chavez leaves and nothing happens. There's Chavez in which everybody realizes that the country is ruined and there's no money to continue maintaining a system in which there's no debate about wealth generation or no real debate about wealth redistribution. The whole game, whether you're in the government or the opposition, is how to get access of this easy wealth that's in oil, and are you better or not at distributing it than the previous guy? But the fact is that there is no money. That money doesn't exist. The expectations of the people are greater than the availability of resources. So all of these things point that the country is up for a big surprise. And that element of todo puede pasar, I think, is the element that actually condemns both the government and the opposition. You cannot take a country to a point in which everything can happen. That is a risk Venezuela is facing. And some of the elements that can happen are actually pretty dire. They're more dire, and that's when I said that the transition is difficult. They're more dire than anything that we've seen in the region. With 11 million guns in the street, with a military totally fractured, with elements of the military deeply involved in the narco business, you've got a lot of problems to deal with. There's a lot of people who are not going to let go. There's a lot of people who are going to fight for the turf. There are going to people who are going to think that what they've earned over this years of the revolution is sustainable, whether it's financeable or not. And I think that is the real problem of Venezuela. So I would like to say that the transition will require the emergence of referential characters, the co-opting of those moderates within El Chavismo that will need to govern, and also the support from the outside. But that support from the outside has to come after a good diagnostic. The problem with Venezuela is not that the opposition is not united. That's one additional problem. There are bigger problems, and they're problems that will affect not only peace in Venezuela, but also has some impact in the region and beyond. I would say, I conclude that the people in Venezuela are fed up, and they don't seem to have a clue as what to do next. Thank you.
Good afternoon. How are you? I'm going to focus on the reaction, I guess, from the United States. From the legislative branch, with some comments, specific comments directed towards our executive branch. First, I'm going to start off with the context in which we're making the decisions that we are making and how Latin America in general has changed a bit. And then I will focus on our efforts to support democracy and human rights in Venezuela and how I see those efforts being hampered. Jaime, I'd like to thank you for organizing this panel today. It's definitely very timely. Our foreign policy in Latin America continues to struggle with perceptions that the United States has neglected the region. These perceptions have been inaccurate or incomplete in my view, but despite the announcement that the president made during the State of the Union that he would be traveling to Brazil, Chile, and El Salvador, many feel, rightly so in my opinion, that U.S. engagement and involvement in Latin America over the last 2 years has been less than what was expected. While the United States and Europe fret over huge deficits and threats to a fragile recovery, this region has prospered. Latin America, beset in the past by debt defaults, currency devaluations, and the need for bailouts from industrialized countries, is experiencing robust economic growth that is the envy of its northern counterparts. Strong demand in Asia for commodities like iron, or tin and gold, combined with policies in several Latin American economies that help control deficits and keep inflation low, are encouraging investment and fueling much of the growth. The World Bank actually forecasts that this region's economy will grow at an average of 4.5% this year. With differences in the economic environment in the region and here at home, the United States is suffering from high unemployment and might have high inflation. It's clear that the environment for our relations with the countries in the region has changed. If we are to be successful in today's Latin America, we must establish a contemporary, clear sense of our interests and develop a more effective means for advancing them. Engagement is an important part of the equation, but our relationship building in this regard must be done with U.S. interests at the forefront. The United States should be dedicated to working with countries in the Western Hemisphere, especially regarding building strong democracies that respect human rights, forging market economies, safeguarding their own domestic security when countries ask us for that type of assistance, and working cooperatively to safeguard the collective security of the region. In advancing these priorities, the U.S. must be willing to be forceful when the realization of our core objectives is being threatened. In this regard, and in the region, the situation in Venezuela is an obvious example. For years, senior Venezuelan military officials have been involved in narcotics activities, and the Venezuelan government increasingly makes common cause with Iran, Syria, Burma, and North Korea regarding international security and WMD issues. And then there are the issues associated with the condition in which Venezuelans live every day. Today, living in Venezuela is to live in a country where freedom of the press is curtailed, where there's censorship of dissident opinions, and where the expropriation of private property is commonplace. Most recently, President Chavez has proposed new legislation that would ban certain activist organizations from receiving foreign money. The law for the defense of political sovereignty and national self-determination empowers the government to fine a group double the sum it receives from abroad, bar offenders from running for office, and impose similar penalties for inviting foreigners who publicly give opinions that offend state institutions. The law is sweeping but unclear about which specific kinds of organizations are affected. It speaks of groups promoting political rights and individuals engaging in political activities without defining how foreign funding for these might incur prosecution. As a result of this new law, there's great uncertainty in Venezuela today because many organizations are in doubt about whether to continue projects that were financed by foreign sources. Most NGOs in Venezuela rely on Venezuelan donors, but many also receive funding from abroad. Specifically, some of it has come from the United States, from the National Endowment of Democracy, and from the U.S. Agency for International Development. The work that many NGOs do is not political. Provea NGO, for instance, publishes annual murder statistics that officials have stopped releasing. 13,985 homicides reported to authorities in 2010, confirming that the status of Venezuela, and in particular Caracas, as one of the most violent places in the world. Some activists in Venezuela are wondering how donors will respond to the new law, and whether any will hold back on providing money. We here in the United States, in the Congress in particular, are wondering how our administration will react. Will the administration pull back its efforts? Will they continue? Or will they work on innovative ways to remain effective in the face of the new law? Already, U.S. aid programs have been barred in 2 regions, in Bolivia and in Ecuador, 2 countries. Will Venezuela be next? I, for one, believe this latest law is part of a broader policy by President Chavez, which consists of carefully calculated actions to chill dissent, pressure opposition media, and sideline opponents. This is evidenced by the push in December of last year for a law that allows him to rule by decree for 18 months, effectively superseding the new, less friendly National Assembly that took office on January 5th. This broader crackdown responds to the Venezuelan election results of 2010 and has little to do with recent events in the Middle East. To wrap this up to the general topic, yet I have no doubt that Chavez is closely following the unrest in Egypt and its ramifications for Venezuela. Given Mubarak's decades-old alliance with the United States, Chavez is in the ironic position of endorsing a popular movement against an autocratic government, even while he continues his own repression at home. Nevertheless, I would hope that the Venezuelan opposition leaders may draw inspiration from the Tunisian and Egyptian protesters. I think, as Pedro mentioned, there are some areas where they do need improvements, but I would hope that the current events that we see now in Egypt and in Tunisia serve to encourage folks in Venezuela that are fighting for their rights to band together and find ways to be more effective. These are my remarks. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Evan?
want to say, looking around the room, it's a real honor for me to be here among so many distinguished analysts of Venezuela, former ambassadors, former very, very distinguished personnel. Also, it's a privilege for me to be invited by Jaime Darrenblum, Ambassador Darrenblum, in Hudson Institute, and to share this panel with so many distinguished guests. I'm a professor with the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, which is part of National Defense University, and so as a member of the government, I need to start with a disclaimer that my views are strictly my own views and not in any way views of the U.S. government. With that caveat, I'm going to go through a presentation relatively rapidly. There's a lot of information, but it's available, and it will be available later on the site for those of you who want to go into more detail or in the question and answer period. But in the interest of not taking too much time, I'm going to go relatively rapidly. It's ironic that it actually has been since, if memory serves me correctly, since 1908 and General Juan Vicente Gomez that a leader in Venezuela has survived so many years in power. Obviously, the comparison to Egypt in the moment is, again, as has been pointed out very well already, a long-standing leader which in many ways has repressed opposition, has used control over institutions to live within a democracy, but with the discomfort that what is involved is a democracy, and the question of whether there's a contagion effect in the region. What I have up here is my own personal thesis. I think it actually coincides with most of the rest of the panel. What is obviously emphasized by many people is that the Chavez regime, in terms of performance, social performance, economic performance, oil production, etc., is falling apart. However, despite that failure of the regime, I believe that it is very difficult to see a situation in which either prior to 2012 or in the 2012 presidential elections, you will see anything that looks like a peaceful transition away from a Chavez government. I also believe that it's not likely to see a military coup or other non-democratic transition, but of all of the possible types of transitions, that is probably the one that is most possible. However, if it occurs, I believe that it's going to occur with even more pain, even more distress than we see now. If we try to think about what a regime is capable of, what a people that is against a government is capable of before rising up, one has to remember Kim Jong-il and the situation in North Korea. And arguably, Venezuela is a long way from North Korea. As a distinguished colleague of mine said also, Venezuelans are not the type of people that burn themselves in the street, because when they protest, they want to be around to benefit from the thing that they're changing. And so I think that we will see more Chavez, and the argument I make is that there are really four pillars of sustaining the current situation, for good or bad. One is the fact that there continues to be, although being undermined, an alignment between the disenfranchised, the people in the rancheros in Caracas and elsewhere, with the Chavez leadership. It's something that's weakened, but still continues to be an important pillar of the relationship that is not yet broken. Second of all, foreign support, whether deliberate or otherwise. China, Russia, and Iran principally have allowed the Chavez regime to survive in ways that previous regimes dependent on traditional international financing and international investment have not been able to do so, pursuing the types of policies that Chavez has. Third, there is an absence of credible alternatives in terms of the leadership. With all due respect to the many distinguished Venezuelan politicians in the opposition, they have not yet formed a credible single alternative. And fourth, there is very little social base for mounting such an opposition. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but this is the core point I'm trying to make. With respect to Chavez, one of the things that's often overlooked is that the people who brought Chavez to power in the face of a broken opposition in 1998 are not issue voters. The people who support Chavez, who listen to Allo Presidente, support Chavez largely because they see the rhetoric and the style of leadership, and they believe that Chavez power means that they, the disenfranchised, have a voice. It's not about a complex decision about whether Chavez's action is or is not bringing them prosperity. The symbol of Chavez means that the poor, the disenfranchised, the down and out are in power. And Economic logic and issue voting is not going to change that opinion. However, what we do see is those opinions are eroding. It's often been pointed out in the recent congressional elections, Chavez collectively lost about 2 million voters to what he had had in previous elections. We see that technically there was a majority of people who voted against the Chavez government if you pull together all of the opposition parties. We see that some recent polls, the most recent came out in December, Consultores 21, indicates that, contrary to what some other polls say, a vast majority of the people in Venezuela are profoundly in disagreement with elements of the Chavez program, as my distinguished colleague has mentioned earlier. At the same time, it's also important to recognize that foreign financing is helping to provide, at least in the short term, the type of liquidity that Chavez needs to continue in power, although it's kind of a bit of a loan shark behavior, because in the long run, that is creating checks that the Venezuelan state, whoever replaces Chavez, will not be able to pay. However, we do have to recognize that $28 billion in foreign loans and loan commitments from China alone, as well as investment commitments to bring on the new Venezuelan oil, principally Junin 4 by the Chinese and Junin 8 by the Russians. Although I'm told that, Junin 6 by the Russians, although I'm told that some of the promises that led to the Junin 6 investment for the Russians are not panning out, and the Russians are becoming a little bit disappointed with what's happening there. However, these pillars of the regime, Iran, Russia, and China, do, at least in the short term, give Chavez the type of resources and latitude that he needs to continue to keep his core support base of the disenfranchised content and thus avoid truly serious challenges to his power. Absence of credible alternatives. One of the problems, whether true or not, is that Chavez is very good at reminding the Venezuelan people that he came into power because of the disorientation, the alienation with the repeated variation in power between COPE and CD that had occurred before. There's a sense of, well, we might not feel comfortable with Chavez, but Chavez continuously reminds the people we don't want to return to what was before. In addition, although there has been some signs in the congressional election that the opposition, through Unidad Nacional, was able to pull at least some of the most important parties, the opposition has not yet fully and effectively united, and it's not clear that they will be able to unite coherently around one candidate, particularly, as my colleague has pointed out, in light of a leader who plays for keeps and will do everything possible, pulling out all stops to divide the opposition. Also, it's important to point out that Chavez does play for keeps, and he plays strategically with the control of the vast resources of the state. And when one looks at what has happened any time a true national figure has begun to emerge that could present problems to the Chavez regime, using control over the courts, etc., to bring corruption charges or other charges, one only has to remember the previous head of Zulia State, Manuel Rosales, or Eduardo Lapi, or indeed the MAS candidate, governor of Aragua, Hidalgo Bolivar, who all three of which are now in Peru in political exile, as well as the national figure Osvaldo Alvarez, who had the audacity to claim that Venezuela had become a narco-trafficking state, and was immediately taken to jail, although I understand he is now out on bail. Or Leopoldo Lopez, the running originally for the mayoradom of Caracas, and found that he and 270 other candidates were disqualified on the accusation that they had committed corruption. Or Raul Baduel, also a reference that had been made before, the person who basically kept Chavez in power after the 2002 ouster of Chavez, but who, again, had the audacity to begin to speak out against Chavez in 2007, 2008, and also found himself attacked on corruption charges. The bottom line is, even if an opposition candidate effectively can emerge, it's very, very dangerous to be a national opposition candidate that poses a threat to Chavez under the current situation. In terms of the lack of safe basis for opposition, again, as my very distinguished colleague has pointed out, it's hard to mount a sustained opposition without institutional and economic resources. And what we see is that there is almost no space in the Chavez government for becoming an alternative figure. For example, we find that as of 2010, the average duration of a Chavez mayor of a Chavez figure was about 6 months. You serve at the pleasure of Chavez, and that doesn't give you much latitude to go against Chavez. in the legislature also has been pointed out. Despite the success, there have been steps to curtail what the legislature can do, not only through the enabling law with the rule by decree, which will step over some of the limits that legislature can impose in terms of special laws, but also some sense that the legislatures who actually have been elected, and I'll protect my sources who've had a rather critical review of this. They might be on the right side of the political spectrum, but they may not have the experience in committee behavior and otherwise in the oil sector and elsewhere to really mount the types of questions, to really mount the type of oversight that is needed to control what happens administratively in Venezuela. We can, and in the interest of time, I'll go a little bit more rapidly, but we can talk about what has happened in the press, that with the disappearance of our CTV, with the attacks against Guillermo Zulaga and Global Vision, you've effectively seen the elimination of effective institutional press. I think my colleague, Mr. Meacham, has also made that point very effectively, although there are surviving, at least for those who follow the printed press, a number of effective opposition newspapers. States and localities, although there are a number of key states controlled by opposition figures, the problem is that Chavez, using his national control, has effectively taken institutions away from those states. We only have to remember 2008 with the taking away of the ports in Maracaibo, Puerto Cabello, and other resources that the opposition could use in any type of campaign against Chavez. To continue, obviously, briefly to talk about the military, the issue is that the upper levels of the leadership, through the combination, being very frank, of being allowed to participate in narco-trafficking activities, you're kind of a blackmailed if you do, blackmailed if you don't. You can continue to become rich as long as you go along with Chavez, but if you don't, you're vulnerable to prosecution on corruption charges. And the comments last November upon his ascension to the head of the uniformed military, General Rangel Silva, pointing out that the military in Venezuela was, in his words, married to the political project in Venezuela. There is, however, and it's important to point out, some very real and persistent discontent in the lower ranks of the same nature that historically in Venezuela gave rise to change. Ironically, to a certain dissatisfied colonel in 1994 who thought about overthrowing the previous order. However, the problem is that you need certain conditions by which that discontent becomes really comes out. Wanted to point out also, of course, with the nationalization of industry in Venezuela, you have some relatively severe problems of finding bases of opposition there. So let me get very quickly to what I see is probably the only realistic scenario. Much has been said about the collapsing institutions, the crime, the problems with basic services. In the interest of time, I won't go into exactly what's happened, but I think it's a crushing case. However, despite this, despite the declining petroleum production, despite the increasing expenditures on the misiones and things like that, what you really need at the end of the day is a catalyst. A very distinguished colleague of mine, one of the people who taught me many of the things that I've come to know about Venezuela, distinguished ex-PDVSA executive Gustavo Coronel, said to me, violence in 2012 is only likely if Chavez increases the price of gasoline, bans the sale of beer, or cancels the baseball season. Things fundamental to the Venezuelan political culture. And the point is that Venezuela can bear a lot worse than what we've already seen. The only situation that I can reasonably see is that if there's a catalyst event that really makes the violence bad, and there's the possibility because of the national police and their character, there's a possibility because of the distinction and control between the national police and the local police, and the control of the local police in the hands of opposition in some key places, that you could have that type of confrontation. It's not a likely scenario, but it's a possible scenario. The issue is that the military would have to be drawn in. And the military has got a lose-draw calculus getting involved right now. The best that could happen in such a circumstance, if the military feels that they have to come to the rescue of the Chavez regime because their privileges are tied to the fate of Chavez, is that they save the regime. The worst that could happen is, for them, is what we're talking about here, which is that, as has happened in 2002 and as happened in 2008, that the low ranks in the military refused to shoot upon the Venezuelan people. in which case the deployment of the military could turn into a turning of the military, or at least the turning of the lower ranks, the defection of the lower ranks against the leadership, and thus at that point things could really begin to happen. Again, I don't see that as a probable scenario, but I see that as one of the few possible scenarios for real political change prior to, say, 2015. But if that does happen, keeping in mind the militias and others, it's going to be a bloody, chaotic situation, and one that's very, very worrisome for the Venezuelan people as well as the regime as a whole. Thank you. Apologize for the time, but appreciate your attention.
Muy bien, muy bien.
Can I sit here and do it? Sure. So I can point a little easier. Well, hello. Excuse me. I'm going to try to sit here so I can indicate a little better. Let me make sure the laser pointer works. Yes. Okay. Well, first off, I want to really thank Ambassador Daremblum, Jamie, for inviting me here again to Hudson. And he gave me a topic that I had to think about a little bit. I'll try to stick to what I was ordered to do, or requested to do, I should say. I spent a couple years in Venezuela, 2008 and 2009, the entire year, for which I want to make sure in the beginning that I thank not only the Fulbright Association, American Fulbright Association, but the Central University, at the Central University in Caracas, CENDES, the Center for the Study of Development, who was for 2 years sponsored me, and without that I couldn't have done nearly anywhere near this sort of research. Let's get going here. So the way I interpreted what my charge is to talk about the petroleum sector and social tensions in Venezuela. Okay, no. It's interesting. Okay. The slides, somehow the background is black. I don't know how that happened. Okay. Well, anyway, I'm going to have let's hope this works. I have 3 topics. Break this down. The question of production, or what I should say, the sector in and of itself, the petroleum sector. And if there's, given the time, depending on the time, that's what I really want to focus on. Something about Chavez and PDVSA's strategy for the oil sector. And the third is assessments and prospects. In the first, here it comes. Well, the part I'm talking about actually doesn't show up. So, okay, that's interesting. So let's just go through this. I just want to show you that one of the biggest things, normally I give quite a data-driven talk, but now I'm going to talk, I'm going to more talk about the social implications. But I do have to show you this. The price of oil, and this is U.S. gasoline, but we're interested in the price of oil. These are the forecasts. I just wanted to show you forecasts that the U.S. Energy Information Administration, our Department of Energy, has. And basically, I would say a number of experts, this is something that's a bit subjective, but President Chavez and the government, the Bolivarian government, really needs prices probably somewhere in the higher 80s in order to maintain things into the next few years, to pay back the debt and so forth. And so, but that's sort of where the projections are. I would say there's other people who project that's going to go up well over 100. But in either case, he'd be very lucky, and it would. A lot of problems are washed aside in Venezuela, no matter who's running the country, if the price of oil goes up like that, right? Now, Venezuela, there's been a lot of discussion about the problems in PDVSA itself, its ability to actually produce oil, and the fall. Now, these again are data from the U.S. EIA, and you could see there's this trend in production. Basically, I drew a line here at about 2.5, and about 2.4 or 2.5 is what we're talking about today. And so there's this consistent problem of the fall in production in Venezuela that PDVSA has not been able to get the production back up to previous levels or up anywhere near where it could go. If you consider the new heavy oil that has been certified in the Faja of the Orinoco, as Chavez or Minister Ramirez often point out, in fact, they're getting to the point now where they have as much or more proven reserves as Saudi Arabia. But developing that oil is another question. Okay? Now, if you really, this is kind of interesting, is if you really want to know, this is taken from the Energy Intelligence Briefing. I have to thank David Knapp, an editor over there, who's really I would say the go-to guy in my experience, for analyzing how much oil Venezuela is producing. Something interesting happened. There's the new PDVSA transparency, where the ministry now actually does something that no other OPEC country does. Now, we could talk about why they do this, but basically accountants go onto every ship leaving Venezuela, and if you're on the list, you can get a report about how much oil is leaving from every ship and every port in a certified way. And it's fairly difficult to analyze this. The people at the Energy Intelligencer have done this. This is just an example, just to show you. I mean, here's the official Venezuelan oil production that you get from that. I think if we go back here, in December, he gave they analyzed export requirements implies domestic crude output of 2.448 million barrels a day, which is a slight increase over the previous. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this. It's actually a very interesting thing in and of itself to understand how the sector works. A lot of the ships that leave actually return because it's the nature of how oil is distributed in Venezuela. The very large refineries are along the coast, so it makes sense. So you have to watch how you count the oil. But if you do this, these people at Energy Intelligencer, for example, in the summer, they determined that probably 300,000 barrels a day are going to China, not 200,000 barrels a day, and figured out a number of things. In my I asked David the other day, and basically the problem here is it's very complicated to figure this stuff out, to really go through and understand what this means. But it is interesting. Why has this happened? This is quite a change. And I'll get back to that. Let's go. I'm sorry about this. So, under production, attitudes of labor and attitudes of professionals in management. I'll just leave that up for a minute. Since my words aren't working up there quite well. I would say this problem of the fall in production in PDVSA should not be seen separate from other problems, the general crisis, some of the general crises in Venezuela. There's this crisis, of course, of institutions. Why does this come about? I mean, yes, there's been quite a contribution to this under the Chavista government, but there's been a long process of problems as an oil state of what's happened. Of course, in the 1980s in Latin America in general, is known as, in development circles or other economic circles, is known as the lost decade. It was a period of prolonged low prices in oil, and there is a certain, because of that, of course, institutions, government institutions, PDVSA, in various ways took hits. At the end of that period, of course, we know that was the time when Venezuela starts to default on its loans, and there's the neoliberal or Washington consensus paqueta of Carlos Andrés Pérez. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, a number of corrupt institutions, heavy-handed management of the economy were swept away. But what's interesting is this was a surprise to society. It's something that wasn't prepared for any length of time ahead. Society wasn't warned in a sufficient way that these problems were coming, and so there wasn't the broad political support you would expect. It was a surprise. So while the people implementing the neoliberal package destroyed various institutions that might have been causing problems in the country, they weren't building anything. They didn't come with their own political party. They didn't come with their own cadre that had been in the opposition for years that could come into the state and understood their programs and could build the institutions. So at the end of their period, it wasn't just the working class and poor that opposed them, but they actually managed to get the capitalist class against them, for the most part, in a quite fierce way. And so when they leave, there's, again, as far as institutions are further eroded. And then we know, I'm just jumping ahead, you have President Chavez comes to power, and based on, again, not a long-time organized opposition political party with cadre and so forth, say in the case of Lula, that had grown up from the base up, but he comes from the top down with a military organization united with many social movements. And social movements are able to wrest power away from old institutions and break down old institutions, in many cases that indeed were corrupt in various ways. But as far as building the new, that's, again, very difficult. So I just want to put the Chavista experience of a certain decay of institutions in perspective of a long-term problem I believe Venezuela had faced. Now, Mr. Chavez's idea seems to have been to build parallel institutions. And he did this in a number of places, in unions, in the economy, in the misiones with health and so forth, but they never actually take over. Or what happens is the ministries are repeatedly split, and you get this dissolution, continues growing. So bringing this a little bit back to the question of oil, we have in the oil sector, there are these ideas in Venezuela, which I find not only amongst Chavistas, they're very strong, the leadership of the Chavistas, but I find books written by leaders of the opposition with similar ideas, that there's a world of peak oil coming, and the oil is running out, and so Venezuela will have what's commonly referred to as the last coke, el último coke, in the desert. Okay? And that's the faja. Now that creates a certain mentality when it comes to developing this oil, because if it's the last coke in the desert, even if you screw up and don't develop it on time, like why weren't contracts let out before the price fell? The Chavez government had several years after the reorganization of the sector to let out the contracts when the price was high, and they would have gotten great terms from the foreign companies, whether it's the national oil companies, China and Russia, or Total, whoever, BP. But they didn't get it together. But on the other hand, then they say to themselves, well, it's the last coke in the desert. No matter what we do wrong, they're going to need this stuff. And so they insisted through 2007 and 8 on essentially the same requirements, the same sorts of prices. And there was a fierce argumentation back and forth under the table in meetings and so forth between the foreign companies, including the Chinese and whoever, and the Russians, as well as the private companies, and the government, one by one, knocking down various things. And it took till February or March of the past year before finally, for the first time under Chavez's government, new contracts were signed for the Faja of the Orinoco. And these are contracts in the order of $10 billion, and more each. And there was a lot of excitement. This is going to go forward. And from everything I can tell, from talking to my contacts, it's returned to a state where nothing is going forward. And a number of the original agreements have fallen apart. And there's a swing back and forth. So why does this take place? And I would say there's a sort of dialectic or contradictory situation. When the price of oil is low and the government's in trouble, it's the only government in Latin America, only state in Latin America with a negative growth in GDP aside from Haiti, you've got to call in the foreigners. You've got to make deals. That means you have to make concessions. And in principle, he's not against making those concessions, but he'd rather not make some of those concessions to the foreigners running the fields, basically, because they don't have an oil company. And whether it's above the table or under the table, you've got to let them more or less run it if they're going to bring in $10 billion, right? And some of those, he bit the bullet and finally started making some of those deals last February or March. But then the price of oil starts going up. And I have to say, and then if you read WikiLeaks, for example, the president of Eni there was more or less bragging to the American ambassador how he was able to stick it to Chavez because he was stuck. And you could, the details. And you can imagine how this irritates Mr. Chavez. And when the price of oil goes up, you can put that off. And if they want to make a deal, let's wait until the price is high and we'll give them the original terms. All right. Now, some of this is from nationalist perspective. Some of it is perspective of who's going to control details of the oil, the money, the flow later also. So I think that's one way, and it's a torturous back and forth. The Chinese, it's the same for the Chinese as everybody else. But what I'd like to do now is stick to the social a little bit and say that, first of all, I want to, it's the part that doesn't show up. Okay, so what I'm talking about is attitudes of labor and attitudes of professionals and managers. So I spent a fair amount of time talking to, especially people outside of PDVSA who used to be in PDVSA and foreign oil companies and so forth, but also quite a bit of time in my research, a fair amount talking to people who work in PDVSA. And it was my experience that, just try and say in an objective way, that PDVSA is not rojo rojito. This is what President Chavez called, red, the reddest red or something like this. My experience is inside of PDVSA, you sort of have at least two different major groups. You have the people who continued working when the paro took place, the big work stoppage in 2002, who continued working and stayed loyal to the president. And then you have other newer people who came in, younger people who came in. Unfortunately, there's not sufficient people been trained to really bring back the industry. That's another question, as my colleagues have said. But I noticed amongst the older ones who were there and stayed, it was interesting to me, and this is along the lines of what might be a source of rebellion, or I shouldn't, or of tensions, I should say, I mean to say. They mainly stayed. There's a lot of nasty things that can be said back and forth after a strike, and one group's been fired and the other group's in, you can imagine, okay, whether it's in the United States or Venezuela. So there's quite a polarization. However, a number of people from old PDVSA will say we had a very well-run company. It was run just like an American, they'll say just like an American company from Texas. We worked with the Americans, we knew how to run the company. And I talked to the other side, I came to who worked in the company in those days, and a lot of them, it's interesting, are actually proud of the way that sometimes things ran. But a number of them felt, when I started talking about them, they would say, there was a glass ceiling, if you weren't sort of from certain families, they would say, or there's a glass ceiling. It's like, because it was a meritocracy, because they would train you, send you to an American school, then if you come up against what you perceive as a glass ceiling, you're really ticked, all right? And some would say I'm a woman, so I wasn't as preferred, or I was darker skinned, and they all would have, or I was gay, they would say, and there was a certain glass ceiling. And at the end I said, this sounds like talking to people in an American corporation in the 60s or 70s, when we had the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, and so forth. It's not that different. And it sort of apparently it seemed to me, got convolved or mixed together with these nationalist issues going on at the time. And so a number of them told me that's why they stayed there, because they thought some of these issues and issues of corruption would be resolved because that's what the president was promising. Now, right now, those people are very upset for the most part because they didn't get what they thought was going to happen. Yes, I mean, some of these overt, perhaps type of discrimination, but there's a new type that's stronger, which is what political party are you brought from? Were you brought in by the minister to be on his side? And that sort of thing, were you brought in as a party member, and those things. So another type persists, not necessarily from the same origins, but this sort of thing persists, and they're very upset. And they're also very upset because they know how the oil industry is supposed to run. So what I was told at times is that a lot of times they don't disagree with Minister Ramirez's a particular plan for the market, or a particular plan for expansion. But then they get very upset at the details of how it's run in an incompetent way, run in a cronyist way. And who is it making the most trouble? It's the people who stayed on and stayed loyal during the paro and weren't fired, end up being the ones, I'm told, causing the most trouble for the present leadership. To the extent that at one point some came to me and they were very upset, this man is calling us escuálidos. This is what you call what she used to call the people who were, kicked out of PDVSA. So it's very interesting. I could talk about my perception of the new people who come in. You get people who are honest, who believe in the revolution and so forth, and then they come in and see corruption. They're also very upset because it's not what they expect. Then you have other people who are, I would say more or less ordinary people who get a degree in engineering or a secretary or something and come in, and their understanding of how oil works is that's where, the better off people went, and when you're ever in the oil company you had money and it's kind of okay to live this way, and there's a kind of rationalization of corruption. It's a very intense situation. And when you ask people, is this a socialist country, should it be a socialist country or capitalist country, I found middle managers especially very strongly saying, this is nonsense. I mean, not everybody, but no, we're not a socialist country. We're not in a condition to be a socialist country. On the other hand, pure capitalism won't work. We need a mixed economy. This is real. We have to live in a capitalist world, and we have to sort of have a social democratic taking care of our social problems. And so this idea that it's rojo rojito, I don't think that's exactly how it works. And I'll just go quickly, I don't want to take too much time, and talk a little bit about the working class. So I'm talking, anyway. Now, that's there are plenty of corrupt people who take bribes and under the table and have contracts overseas. And I'll point out this, when any government, when you think if even people who are pretty honest, when they think the government is going down or they might lose their job, they maybe before wouldn't put money overseas. but now they're worried about their family, and they'll rationalize things. So corruption can kind of exponentially pick up when people lose confidence, people who normally wouldn't participate in it. Just a comment. I want to talk about a little bit about, well, the working class. I'll try to do this a little more quickly. I'll put my notes aside. Let's see, the elections were held in 2009 for a unified leadership of the oil workers section. There's basically three main groups. One group was a company union, was formed by Chavismo, and was Rojo Rojito. It's the union that would be used to seize oil rigs and so forth when there was a problem. What happened is, it was interesting that basically all the main groups of the workers, both opposition and Chavista, did agree on one thing. Before we finally renegotiate this new contract with PDVSA, with Ramirez, we need a unified platform. We need to have a unified leadership to face the company. So they spent well over a year and a half, something like that, back and forth in negotiations with Ramirez. We want real elections, and there was all sorts of things. How do you prove you work for the company? How long will you have to have worked there? You're going to have to show your card before you can vote, so that the elections wouldn't be rigged. And they were going to have the National Electoral Council, supervise this. So there was a back and forth, torturous sort of negotiations, and finally there was an agreement to have the election. Just before the agreement, you could tell Ramirez was worried about how this might come out. Now, it appeared to me that the opposition, as my colleagues have said, was rather weak in these days, that if this went badly, this could lead to a strike across the board for oil workers, because more and more, as the economic crisis hit, there's not frank imposition of layoffs and restructuring and belt tightening, but there also wasn't oftentimes in old governments. It's like the money doesn't show up. Suddenly you find out you can't go to the health clinic. Suddenly, your pay, you just don't get your pay. And that was happening, and there was a lot of confrontations where both Chavista workers and ordinary and opposition workers or other workers would jointly go and confront managers that we want our pay. We want to go to the health clinic. You weren't putting money in the retirement. And so the election took place, and the Chavista group just barely won nationally. But they lost for example, in Maracaibo and other places. And what came out is some of the opposition workers got major positions, and there was corruption, but the opposition said, put this aside in the name of unity. And what's happened, it's very interesting, the ones who were the Chavista leaders before are now quite upset with the government oftentimes. What's happened is the new contract then was imposed. Ramirez gave a speech in Maracaibo with some guys all with red shirts, whoever they were, and said that just before the election, you know what? How can a socialist government negotiate a contract with non-socialist workers? We'll only negotiate with the socialist union, which had been his tactic in other places. The workers rejected this across the board. But in any case, the new contract, the socialist wage wasn't as high as they thought it was going to be, the ones in the red union. And what's happened since then is the old contract was about 45 bolivars a day was the standard wage. The new one is 69. Lake Maracaibo was nationalized, Lake Maracaibo, and that's a whole long story why that happened. But all these people who worked in Lake Maracaibo were brought into the company, and that's something that should encourage them, you would think, to be, pro-government. But it turns out most of those guys are actually getting the 45 bolivars still after the new contract took effect at the beginning of 2010, rather than the 69. And recently, there was a poll in western Venezuela. Some polls have been taking place in the oil fields. What are workers being paid? It appears that Ramirez made a deal with the foreign companies. I can't swear to this, but it looks like this is the workers are accusing them of allowing them to continue paying $45 a day rather than 69. And there's been strikes, hunger strikes, and protests and so forth. So I better stop pretty soon. So there is this opposition has grown up. So why don't I just skip ahead to the end? Whoop. Unfortunately, the colors don't come. So I would just second actually statements that Evan made and Pedro also. Why don't we do this? Is that with this crisis of institutions in Venezuela, there is it's clear that there's this growth in social tensions and inside PDVSA, both in the leadership, the management, as well as in the rank and file. However, as with the rest of the opposition, it includes many more Chavistas than in the past, as well as people who are traditionally with the opposition. It's becoming much more broad. But they're certainly not ready in any way if there was a transition, even if just an elected transition, if another figurehead came in from the opposition, say, and ran the country, without the cadre, without a unified political party that had been around for a period of time and gained experience, to take a state that's in the state it is in and try and run it, it would be a very difficult situation. And if there was social conflict, if it was perceived that this was not taken legitimately, it would be even more of a let's say chaotic situation, a fairly dangerous situation. So it's a complicated situation to perceive how transition might take place, and it's normal at some point. Every president has to go.
Thank you, Tom. We're going to start a period here of questions, comments, etc. Those who want to ask things, to please identify themselves, affiliation, and to which member of the panel you're referring to. Mr. Dawson.
Congratulations to the panel for the brilliant presentation, and now I would like to make a question to all of them about do you think Iran is playing a role in Venezuela or in Egypt like it's being played in Venezuela in the current crisis in the Middle East? Do you think that Iran in some ways behind what happens in Egypt and as it is behind what's happening in Venezuela?
I think it's an excellent question. I want to make a distinction in terms of the outside powers that are assisting Chavez in one way or another. I believe that of the three, Russia, Iran, and China, Iran is probably the least important with respect to actually helping to maintain the Chavez regime. Now, having said that, in terms of potential threats to the U.S. and regional stability, Iran is probably in the short term, in my judgment, the greatest. And it's largely through Iran's pursuit of its own agenda in the regime. Banks such as the International Development Bank, through which Iran may be seeking to escape sanctions and cooperate with Venezuela to pursue portions of its own nuclear proliferation program. Other types of aid, such as the working of Iranian agents in Venezuelan mosques or in nearby Colombia and Guajira, to radicalize and work with those communities, basically, more than anything else, not to do anything nefarious in the region immediately, but to send money which ultimately goes to radical activities in the Middle East, etc. So I think Iranian activities in Venezuela really is a jumping point in supporting other types of Iranian activities in Chipre and Bolivia and elsewhere are a grave matter of concern. But I think at the end of the day, Iran benefits from Chavez more than Chavez benefits from Iran in the immediate context.
Iran is involved in Iraq, according to the mentioned Egypt.
I think the concern of depending on how the democracy movement goes, just in the same way that one talked about, how the Cuban Revolution went, there always is the possibility for Iranian-backed radical movements to hijack democracy in Egypt where it occurs. But difficult to say what the Iranian hand is in current events.
Just quick. There's also. The Brotherhood are not Shias, and they're coming from different places. The Iranians and the Brotherhood in Egypt. historically.
Okay. Lady here.
Okay, thank you. My name is Tony Schott with Global Vision Venezuela. My question is addressed to the panel. What will be the conclusion? Is Venezuela a democracy or not? Because everybody characterizes Venezuela as an authoritarian regime. I mean, the Chavez administration or the regime. So I would like to know what will be the conclusion. And if yes, the answer is yes, what will be the role of the OIS? Thank you.
Take it in the order. Actually, this is a very pertinent question. Venezuela has the trappings of a democracy, has still a lot of the elements of a democracy. But also, I think once you study it, I think it's very clear that democracy has been used to destroy democracy. That there's been a systematic process of dismantling the institutions of democracy using, what appeared to be the legitimacy, for example, of controlling an assembly for which only 15% of the population voted. Pushing things right to the edge, controlling all the power so that there's no check and balance mechanism under which you can go. So it appears that the thing is a consensus, it appears that it obeys the law, but there's no challenge that can happen to and be successful, at any instance to that. So the blending of all the powers in one actually probably would lead you to the situation in which you've got somewhat of a totalitarian government. I tend to not like to call it authoritarian because authoritarian governments exercise authority, and this government is particularly bad at exercising authority. It's a very capricious government. If you tell the difference between a police state, whether it was the Soviet Union or China now or Cuba, the trade-off that the population gets in order, when they surrender some of their rights, is an element of law and order that actually is the thing that does not exist in Venezuela. So the Venezuelans are being asked by our government to trade off stuff in return for nothing. That kind of violence, that chaos that reigns in, whether you're doing a bureaucratic transaction, whether you're dealing with Petróleos de Venezuela, as Tom was saying, or whether you're just driving down the streets, that chaos is not associated normally with autocratic governments. Okay? It's a chaotic, capricious government. Okay? That is an extremely dangerous combination, to have not somebody who can at least reward people with the basic semblance. I mean, one can say whatever one can say about Fidel Castro, and there's almost nothing good that you can say about it, but it's not a chaotic system. Okay? It's a system in which people are forced to obey the rules. You like the rules, you don't like the rules, but authority is exercised. The difference of a country in which authority is exercised and a country in which authority is not exercised is, this chaos. This is what I was talking about. This is what puts everybody at risk. And violence does not just go against Escuálido. Violence has hit, and killed many, many people who had all their hopes, all their dreams, and have voted with this regime. So chaos, a regime of chaos is what we have, because we have a man who's capricious. Now, if you go deeper, Sonia, you understand what is the main job of this government. When you understand that key elements within the military and key elements within the civilian leadership are no longer not just turning a blind eye, but have taken over the narcotics business, that's their business. The business is not running a country. The problem is that the Chavistas, those hardcore Chavistas, those criminal Chavistas, do not have an option to Chavez. So we have the same situation. We have an opposition that is not an alternative and is not being able to present an option to Chavez, but people who are in power who are stuck with Chavez. They have no idea what would happen if Chavez disappeared. There's no legitimacy that goes to the vice president. The vice president was handpicked. There's no second figure in the regime that has any support. Part of what was said before, Chavez has made sure that nobody raises high enough to become an alternative, even within his regime. So the real problem is that you have a capricious man surrounded by people who are scared of losing power and nobody else to take there. Now, how do you call that? I call that chaos. I don't call that democracy. I don't call that anything. That's a real situation of why we're in trouble.
Yeah, I'm going to try to answer your question in a way that's consistent with how you asked it. I think that Venezuela, the government there, holds on to certain elements of democracy, but that what they do is they use them to subvert the democratic process, and they use it to justify the concentration of power in the executive. I mean, we saw that with how President Chavez got this vote in the assembly for him to be able to rule by decree. I mean, how democratic is that? I mean, let's be honest. Okay. On your question on the OAS,
I'm sorry, ignore that.
We've for years, my boss has tried to put pressure and tried to encourage, and I'm being very diplomatic, the State Department and Secretary General Insulza himself to raise the issue in the Permanent Council of Venezuela's commitment to democracy, because it's faint. The issue of trying to convince other members on in the OAS to go along with this is the issue that's always raised by the Secretary General. What we'd like to see, nevertheless, is more leadership by the Secretary General in doing what's right in this case. I have many friends, not just in Venezuela, but also in other parts of the region that have lists with specific points that demonstrate or that strengthen a case to really have the discussion about Venezuela's membership in the OAS. And these are questions that need to occur on the regional stage. It's not just good enough for 2 or 3 countries to talk about them. I think we should. I think we should be explicit. I think that sometimes this is what serves as a catalyst to leadership and to going forward. Nevertheless, I think that it's important to have this discussion on a regional basis, because so many of the countries in the region have gone through similar processes, and they would enrich this discussion. That's a necessary one, and the support of these other countries also is an example to demonstrate that things have changed, and that Venezuela really is, and Cuba really are the exception and not the rule in Latin America.
Just want a couple quick comments. The issue of Chavez and others being democratic, I think, is one of the most politically charged and perhaps one of the most misunderstood questions that there is. But having said that, it's also an excellent question. As you know, you go back to the U.S. Revolution, the French Revolution, Robespierre. The notion of legitimacy coming from reflecting the will of the people is a fundamental notion of government in the modern era. Now, does that correspond to what we mean by democracy? Well, you have a country called the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. You had massive voting during the time of Stalin for the party congresses. You have voting which continues in China to this day. In American political science, there is long debate on whether democracy requires voting, does it require other types of representation, and so it's a vast, vast question. I think the fundamental question, though, is the Chavez government legitimate? And in our modern era, legitimacy has a connotation of reflecting the will of the people and the ability of the people to change things if they don't like what they see. And I think, as all of the panelists confirm, whether you talk about voting or not, or other forms of representation, the game in Venezuela, largely through the activity of Chavez, has become rigged. It was hijacked, it is now rigged, and it is now almost impossible for the people who want to change things in Venezuela to be able to change it, either through current elections, through future elections, through other activities, for the reasons we've talked about today. And in that sense, whether you call it democracy or not, the government of Venezuela, by its own actions, purely my opinion, has delegitimized itself.
Well, since we all have something to say, this aspect of caste that it mentions is very interesting. If you look in the barrios, I would say, I mean, it depends on the barrio. Without going through it, does Chavismo have hegemony in the barrios, in the sense that do the majority of the people, are they with him not only with them, sort of spiritually, as you're speaking about, but are they organized in a way? And no, if the government in general had hegemony in the barrios, there wouldn't be this crime. I mean, if the mafia rules a neighborhood, there's not this crime. If a right or left wing dictator rules, crime goes down. The trains run on time. So we're not talking about that kind of thing. Does he have hegemony in the working class? Well, I tried to paint in the preeminent part of the working class, especially the refinery workers. There's quite a bit of old-time opposition, very radicals. It doesn't seem he does. And even when you go to some of the friends who did research on this, when you go to some of the unions and you say, well, your union split, yours went with the PSUV and this other side didn't, and they say something like, it's tactical. We didn't know if we should go in or not. We kept half out because we don't have confidence in them. We put half in to see what's going on. So there's not really hegemony there either. So there's this weakness of institutions everywhere. The PSUV was not organized until 2008. But at the same time, the opposition didn't break out of its old patterns of doing things, preoccupation with ideas of golpes and this kind of thing until about the same time. And there's a characteristic of political parties. The old political parties were destroyed. And there's this characteristic of political parties being smaller groups around charismatic individuals that Venezuela is starting to grow beyond with their new unified opposition. And Chavez was trying to do the same thing with the Chavistas. I mean, he's charismatic, but to unite them. And that's got a long way to go. So to have a democracy is not only the fact that, I think in 2008 especially, Chavez's claim to fame claim to legitimacy is he could win any election, bring it on. And then when he saw that it was changing, he had to make a decision. Is he going to fiddle with the results, take power away from the people that win, or go with it? And he's done the first. He's found ways to take power away from anybody that wins or make it difficult. That was a choice he made a couple of years ago. So there's that, but you have to look at the other side also, the ability. This is a presidential democracy, and former presidents also had leis habilitante that were able to rule by decree. This is there weren't even regional and local elections in Venezuela until Cap became president. Everybody was appointed. So there's a history you're going against, and this is obviously not helpful now. It's going back.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Daniel Kelly from Alliance for Values. Pedro Burelli, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned that the opposition doesn't know what to do. I take it that one of the pieces of advice that you would give them would be to frame the debate or in the saying that it's not just the case of running the oil ministry better and allocating its resources in a more intelligent way and distributing the wealth in a more intelligent way, but painting a vision of the economy and I guess the society in a new way. Did I get that right? And also, what other pieces of advice would you give them?
Well, just before I answer that, I wanted just to say one quick question because I didn't mention the OAS in that answer, and I think there's a relevant issue connecting the OAS as an institution that has not worked to safeguard democracy in Venezuela and other places in the region, but also to to add a country to that list of countries that you mentioned that have supported Chavez. There's a country that goes somewhat unnoticed, but that has been actually extremely pernicious in its behavior, which is Brazil. I mean, Brazil has actually been an apologist for Chavez in every single forum. They've stopped any decision that has been made against Chavez. President Lula went around the world, supported by his chief Latin American advisor, still Latin American advisor to Itamaraty, Marco Aurelio Garcia, telling people that they knew how to control him. Don't get involved. Don't antagonize him. We'll control him. And at the end of the day, after 8 years of Lula, it is not that clear that they did anything to control him. They stopped every discussion, basically at the OAS. Nothing can get there and be discussed. The Brazilians immediately stopped the discussion. And to that extent, while not an alibi to the Secretary General, because Secretary General has, under the Democratic Charter, under Article 19, has the ability to bring subjects to the attention of the Permanent Council without it being required for anybody. What's wrong? I mean, he can bring it, put it, nobody will discuss it, at least as a Secretary General, as a figure. He did, okay, what his conscience told him to do. But of course, then we would have a whole discussion of who Jose Miguel Insulza is, and that's not the subject of this panel. I mean, this is not a medical panel. One of the things, in the question that's asked right now, I do think a new narrative. The opposition needs a narrative. A real narrative as to what it is that they want. And it's not that difficult to build a narrative, because I'm not that sure that what the Chavistas want and what the rest of the Venezuelans want are that different. I don't think there's people who want their children to suffer and be killed in the streets, while others want their children to prosper and live safely in the streets. I think everybody in Venezuela wants exactly the same thing. The issue is that the opposition has not come up in a fight for leadership with a person who can come out and tell a story that is a better story than the one the guy that has the money has. I mean, if one looks at a history, Jaime Lucinchi was a very well-liked guy. He ran the country to the ground, but he ended up, to the last day he was president, with 63% popularity. 2 weeks later, he had 8%. Okay? The issue is, the guy who holds, control of the treasury has a big chance of owning the hearts and minds of the people in Venezuela. So when you're trying to fight for the support of the people and you have nothing in your hand, you have to be really creative, because it's all promise or whatever. But I think in a tradition of leadership that Venezuela had, of democratic leadership, of the Romulo Betancourt, the people who were great storytellers, who were able to get people to consolidate after dictatorship, to begin the early stages, a good part of the 40 years of democracy, as you started building a democratic system. What's lacking right now in Venezuela is that in this little contest for leadership, I think it was just mentioned right now, that parties are made around an individual, not around a great idea, not around a great message. All this little battle, you can actually see it now degenerate as they try to pick a candidate. There's no legitimacy. I mean, I said it sometimes that the Venezuelan opposition is a constant, and this is no offense to small people, but it is a contest of midgets to see who's the highest midget. I mean, this is not a contest of people who are thinking big things. They're not talking about a different country. They're not trying to enamor the population. It's a very, very myopic little game, okay, and a very difficult game. I mean, I give all the credit for those who are involved in the day-to-day struggle of mixing all this variety of people who oppose Chavez to try to come up with a solid platform. Okay, it is not going to be easy. There's no real good advice, but at some point, I think in most countries where you've had a huge meltdown of the political infrastructure, what you get are not political figures. You get moral figures. You get, the Violeta Chamorros, the Corazon Aquino, the Havel, the Mandelas, the Valesas are not people who made it through the political system. One could actually conclude that at some point, I mean, right now we're seeing, 2 days of discussing that this young guy from Google is a guy who's energized the new protests in Egypt. That's the kind of thing that happens when the political system can no longer deliver or give birth to a solution. So the uncertainty is that when you look around, there aren't obvious candidates even for that role. There's not the obvious Violeta Chamorro. There's not the Mandela that's sitting rotting in jail and that everybody's really moved by his actions. Well, Mandela spent 25 years in jail before people realized that he was the option. I mean, there's people right now who are in jail. There's been people who've been persecuted. There's people who are in exile. But until they appear, then the real problem is that the narrative is in nobody's mouth. Nobody's telling the story.
Thank you. Any more questions? I have a question for the distinguished panel here. Are there a number of large or medium youth organizations? Are the social network organizations, are they functioning? How the youth is performing, and what are the goals of those who are performing?
To speak in terms, I think it's relevant to talk about different layers of youth organizations, and everything has been kind of turned on its head, as you know, in Venezuela. So of course you have at one level things that are available to youth through the PSUV, which have resources. At the same time, you also have the traditionally very active interest of the middle class elite in the Facebook, Twitter world of informal communication, the very types of things that can give rise to the mobilization, the types of surprises that Mr. Ureli refers to. At the same time, you have other organizations that we see surprises at the university level. For example, in conjunction with the closure of RCTV, we saw the massive demonstrations, the emergence, at least for a fleeting moment, of people like Juan Goichea, that has now immersed himself in kind of the middle of the pack, if you will, and retreated into obscurity. But the problem with those types of traditional youth movements is that the universities, which depend largely on the state, either directly or indirectly, are broke. And the feeder system to the universities, the education system, is under attack from the education law. And so what we see is that an ever closing of these spaces for non-official youth movements that could give rise to the type of protests that we're looking for.
I'd like to just add something. Having met over the years a lot of this different tiering of youth that emerged in Venezuela. One of the biggest challenges of looking at the future of Venezuela was that the future didn't really seem to care a lot about the future or about the country. That changed dramatically, as was mentioned, in 2007, and suddenly the student movement emerged with an incredible force. I think what they were saying, Chavez, I've always said, has been, and I give Chavez tremendous communicational credit for staying on message and repeating the same thing. It's the past was terrible, the future without me is nothing but a return to the past. And those two messages are reinforced by the fact that nobody from the past has defended any of the good deeds from the past, and some of the bad guys in the past are actually on TV all the time, actually confirming that there's a high likelihood that they'll play a role in the future. So Chavez has been very consistent in his message, and he's been aided in the message. What the students did in 2007 was actually say, look, Mr. President, you are my past, okay? I don't know any other president but you. I don't like the present, and I have a real serious problem about your vision of the future. Chavez could not react fast enough, and that's why I think the defeat in December of 2007 occurred. I mean, Chavez confronted this group. He went frontally against the student movement. He basically did not understand what was coming, and he came in for a big surprise. He then regrouped. The political parties then started capturing some of these figures because they all wanted to have their little student. It's like saying, oh, these are the guys that are doing stuff. I want one in my stable. And they fractured the student movement out along political lines. The second way they fractured it clearly is that students graduate. So you get a new cadre of students, and now I'm the student leader. Now you left, I'm a student movement. And there was not a youth movement created, but he was stuck in a student movement divided with former student leaders who now were the young members of a multitude of political parties. I think because of the experience a lot of those people had, particularly people like Goicoechea with Primera Justicia or other, you're going to eventually see a regrouping of more of a youth movement that will include later years of high school kids, university, and young professionals. And I think that is a formidable force. When you look at polls, one of the most, I would say, structurally strange things and pretty scary things about Venezuela is when people ask, what is the institution that you respect the most? 83% of the people say the students. That's not an institution, okay? When a country is putting all of its hopes in the students, second institution is a church, third is the private sector. Well, guess what? These are the three institutions that Chavez has the biggest dogfight with, okay? But the fact that people have put such a high expectations on the student also indicates why Chavez backed away from the reform of the university law. He is keenly aware that those are the only people who could truly eventually organize. They will, however, have to face traditional politicians who are very afraid of what the student movement means because they're completely dislocated from these people. the student movement do not respect all political figures in Venezuela. And if they are an influential part in generating something, they will also be not necessarily the guys who run the country, but highly influential in who runs a country. And therefore, the major challenge the youth movement will have is actually fighting against some of these entrenched politicians from the opposition who have not understood anything in these last 12 years of what's going on.
Just a follow-up question to Pedro. So what do you think then will it take for that youth movement to actually gel?
I think that could happen tomorrow morning. Could happen in 2 months. It could happen in 6 months. The conditions are there. I mean, this is something that's ready to go. When I said anything can happen, I was referring to that. Any little event can happen. I mean, the raw material for a social explosion are there. You know, the grass is dry. There's a lot of matches around. People have left gunpowder on top of the grass. You know, all these things are happening there. Okay? So try to predict and try to make money betting on when it's going to happen. It's not. The question is not it's not when it will happen, it's if it will happen. And the answer, it will happen. Okay? The end of this story will involve a new generation trying to take control of its future. And I'm pretty sure of that.
Two final questions. Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for being here. My name is Melissa McCarthy, and I definitely agree with you. Something that I found is, I moved here after all the crisis for everything, and something I found living, no one about that or about that, and I agree with you, but what I found is there is a if my and my question is what because right now as every and those that are still there should you
Well,
done?
no, I mean, it's almost a follow-up of what I just said, though. I always measure countries, and I think historically, if you measure country, you can measure the state of development or the state of well-being of a country by the migratory flow. Okay? Are people coming into the country or are people leaving the country? Okay? Venezuela was historically a country in which people were coming into. I mean, and we have waves and waves and waves. We had Italians during the Garibaldi years. We had people before the First World War. We had people during the Second World War. We had, in Venezuela, if anything, probably of all the Latin American countries, even maybe very passed with, in a way with Argentina, was a country in which it was very natural to just move in. It was a country that was open. For many years, it was the most prosperous country in the region. And people came in. You had free exchange rate, of overvalued currency, whatever you made there. You were rich compared to your friends back in Portugal or back in Spain. When you actually see the phenomenon that you're describing, the amounts of people, and you take tons of professions, you take doctors, young doctors, leaving and not coming back. When you look at people, professionals like the people who were thrown away from PDVSA, those guys have made Colombia an energy power. They're in Canada. They're in Azerbaijan. They're in Mexico. I mean, we actually took millions of years of experience and gave it away. Clearly, if you put all that and the new trend of people leaving, you could almost project the future of Venezuela, because at the end of the day, if you lose that human resource, you lose a lot. Having said this, I have met the most courageous, committed people I've ever seen, that you tell them about the odds, you tell them who they're facing, they look at General Henry Rangel Silva, General Cliver Alcalá Cordones, General Hugo Carvajal, drug traffickers. And they understand that these are the guys who they're facing. And they still staying, they're committed, and they're out there planning their next action. So my sense is, I am very pessimistic because of that exodus, but one cannot help but be amazed at the commitment of people who stay. And those people who stay deserve all the understanding, all the support, because it's with their sacrifice and the help of those who left, who hopefully will come back, that we'll have a new country.
This is the final question.
Carlos Manuel Indacochea from the George Washington University. The role of the military have been mentioned many times, and I have to say, to start with, that the military are not immutable. And second, Chavez comes from the rank of the military, and therefore he knows that the command, that the officer corps can become autonomous in their own political thought. He has not been inert about that. He has not been inactive about it. He has set a system of control, especially of the enlisted people, the rank and file, with Cuban advisors. And I'd like to know if anybody knows how advanced is that process and how probable it is, or might be, that the military would break and eventually factionalize, rather than remain solid precisely because the political commissaries are doing their work.
I think it's an excellent question, and I think you have to begin ironically by distinguishing the upper ranks, whom through the combination of, to put it frankly, bribes and permitted corruption, and thus implicitly blackmail. If you turn and go against Chavez, that maintains that system of control at the upper level. Ironically, Chavez, who as a lieutenant colonel realized the power of the middle ranks to go against the upper ranks, seems to be repeating that. Now, as you duly point out, through the use of Cuban intelligence officers and others that actually prompted the recent resignation of a senior Venezuelan general, Chavez is trying to maintain that system of control. However, it's very difficult to do that. And what you also find is, at a certain level, the farther you go down, the broader the base gets, the amount of money that you can personalistically distribute goes down, and the level at which people can see and think for themselves begins to go up. You take a look at what happened with the Cavim facility in Maracay, which just indicates the amount of military mismanagement. You take a look at essentially the disintegration of training. You take a look at the disintegration of other aspects of the Venezuelan military. Chavez might be able to buy some K-8s from China. He might be able to buy Russian aircraft. Although even in that case, you have, of course, the crash of the K-8 flying out of Barquisimeto, which indicates, even at that level, problems with the maintenance and training over a brand new aircraft in a showpiece. I personally believe at the end of the day, Chavez is actively trying to control that military rank. But I think the only reasonable scenario for change that I can see is if you force them into a situation in which the middle ranks, who are imperfectly controlled, feel that they, in the interest of the same democracy that moves other youth and that has moved the military middle ranks in the past in Venezuela, prompts them to make a decisive shift. And I think that's when things will start to get very mixed up.
I'd like to just add one quick thing on the military. Militaries tend to only function as monolith. Okay, if an institution loses its shape and its line of command and its purpose and all that, they're not actually the same thing. That you can call it a military because they all kind of dress the same. They have a code of uniform that they tend to obey. Although even that, when you look at them right now, it looks like it's a little bit confused. But the fact is that the Venezuelan military is no longer a monolith. How many pieces are there? Okay? Well, we can spend time going into the nitty-gritty, and there's a lot of information flowing out as to how divided they are. The United States doesn't have an ambassador now in Venezuela because one dared to say that the military was demoralized. It's funny because that is a word that I've been constantly hearing from within the military, and particularly from that middle rank. It's a complete demoralization. Maybe they're not the best guys, but they're not enjoying the perks that the top guys are enjoying, and therefore they feel that something better should be happening. Now, Hugo Chavez has done something in that need to control, which historically I think no leader of the military, no warrior, no general has done, which is he's created a horizontal reporting structure. At every single rank, from the military academy on, there's individuals at those ranks that report directly to the president. Okay? That creates an incredible problem in the line of command. That if I am a captain and my major says, do this, there's a likelihood that that captain would say, the president told me to do the opposite of what you're asking me to do. That creates a tremendous problem of command, and that actually comes from Chavez's own paranoia as a couster, okay, in which he wants to make sure that at every tier he can intervene the different tiers within the military so that somebody doesn't do what he did to Carlos Andrés Pérez, okay? So when you come into this game as a military guy, but fundamentally as a couster, you will always behave as a couster, okay? And the problem is that it creates a control structure, a management structure of this military, which makes a military an institution that doesn't protect him, doesn't protect the opposition, doesn't protect the Constitution as a notion. And rather than being something that one can look as a guarantee eventually for peace, actually, the nature of the military right now in Venezuela could be the explanation of why we end up in a violent outcome. It is so divided, and when you have the people who have the monopoly on violence, well, in Venezuela, the monopoly doesn't exist. When I said there's 10 million weapons in the street, it's violence is being well distributed out there. But the concept that the military should hold the monopoly on violence, but the institution is not a body in itself and does not respond to a single head, that put it into your equation as one of this dry grass, gunpowder next to a match piece that I was talking about before.
Unfortunately, we have to end here. Let's give our panel a final round of applause. And thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.